So this lesson is on the invasion of the Americas, and I'm going to use the phrase Americas to refer to North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean as well. So, I'm going to talk about the origins of and three phases of Latin America in, those areas that I just mentioned. And so we talk about Latin America here, I'm talking about a civilization, right? So the origins of this civilization we call Latin American civilization, which didn't really exist before the Iberian colonization and the northwestern European colonization of those areas. So, we're going to really focus on pretty much everything from Mexico downwards, or south from there. So, a little bit of framework for what we're going to look at. We're not going to look at North America very much, partially because it's a different geography, different colonizing nations, right? The French and the English versus the Spanish and the Portuguese, different characteristics of the Native American peoples, right? South America and Mesoamerica had large, complex civilizations. North America just didn't. I mean, there was smaller tribal groups. I mean, the Iroquois were starting to form a larger civilization, and perhaps they would have, created a large, full-scale, complex civilization if they had been left alone for, some period of time longer. But, of course, it didn't happen that way. But you're going to get a chance to study, or you should get a chance to study Native American peoples and North America, before the colonial period. You should get a chance to study that in American history and, possibly even American literature. So I'm going to leave those things alone, not because they're not connected, because they really are. These aren't separate. It's kind of silly of me to separate them out like that, but, I just want to leave that material for your American history course. So let's turn our attention now to the conquistadores, right? And who they were, right? The invasion and conquest of Latin America was really affected by the conquistadores, right? And the word itself just means conqueror. It's a Spanish word that just means conqueror. And very often these were lower nobility, so some, aristocrats, but lower level, lower rank ones, often poorer ones as well as commoners and often criminals. I mean, if you're a commoner or a criminal, going and conquering land in the New World is a great way to keep your freedom, to get money, to possibly get your own land. And so that shaped early Latin America, right? You want to remember that the Iberian Peninsula was especially Catholic and still kind of feudal, right? While northern and northwestern Europe were moving into early manufacturing and early industrialization. The economy of Spain and the economies of Spain and Portugal were still mostly feudal and land-based. And so these conquistadors really tried to recreate Iberia in the New World in terms of how they structured their politics and their culture and their societies. Of course, the first area of colonization was the Caribbean. That's where, Columbus landed. And so the first area to become deeply colonized were the Caribbean islands, places like Cuba, Hispaniola, Barbados, places like that, Jamaica. And very high mortality rates due to disease and enslavement. I mean, basically 100% or nearly 100% of the Carib and Taino people were wiped out in the early colonization period. And, I've said before, it kind of led to kind of a lot of empty land. And this was, the Caribbean was a special case, right? I mean, very environmentally delicate. Islands are small places, and there's not a lot of room for waste. And, so very unique circumstances there in the Caribbean that we wouldn't see on the mainland. But the Caribbean did provide very rich opportunities for farming, especially sugar. And as as you're going to see in the Africa lesson, this was a big driver of African slavery, right? Empty land in the Caribbean, a wonderful climate for growing sugarcane, a lot of money to be made. Now, Spain conquered the Aztecs, in 1519. Be sure that you've reviewed the Mesoamerican lecture before you do this part of the project, because you need to understand what Mesoamerican culture was like before the coming of the Spaniards. But the Spaniards kind of came at, for them, a lucky time, and it wasn't a lucky time for the Aztecs. But Spain kind of got lucky. They were able to take advantage of the hatred that a lot of people felt for the Aztecs. Remember, the Aztecs were a large empire who were successful partially because they conquered other people. Well, Spain landed and kind of hooked up with the other people. You want to go kill the Aztecs? Sure. That kind of thing. And at the time that Cortez and his men came, there was a lot of political instability under Montezuma II. It was kind of, a lot of people weren't following him. He wasn't a highly respected emperor. Another thing that helped the conquest of Aztecs was their belief that, their gods would come again from the east, on kind of shining rafts, and their shining gods would come back. A lot of the Aztecs and some of the other tribal peoples in that area, when the Aztecs started showing up, thought that this is where their god's coming back, and so they kind of allowed the Spaniards to have a free ride into the center of the Aztec Empire. And so eventually Hernan Cortez makes a direct assault on Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and is able to take them over. Further to the south, was a very different situation in the conquest of the Inca. In many ways, the conquest of the Inca was less likely. The man who led that conquest, a man named Francisco Pizarro, he had a much smaller force, and he was working with very difficult terrain. The Inca Empire is way up in the mountains in very tough terrain. But, kind of like with the Aztecs, he came at what for him was a very lucky time. There was a civil war going on between the ruler Atahualpa and his brother, and so the Inca Empire was kind of broken up. And he was also able to come in and make local allies who were willing to help him and his men go fight the Inca. And so, they got into the capital and were able to take Atahualpa hostage. Pizarro was really a bad guy. We get this story of, the Spaniards saying that we will let Atahualpa go as long as you fill this room with silver and this one halfway up with gold. And the Inca did that, and Pizarro and his men went ahead and killed Atahualpa anyways. And in kind of one of the great ironies of history and the great, revenges of history, Pizarro himself was murdered at a dinner party by Inca renegades. So this one, the conquest of the Inca was especially bloody and nasty. Not that conquest is ever anything but that, but compared to the Aztecs, what went on in the Inca civilization was far more brutal. And so, one of the early conflicts in Spain itself was the so-called Valladolid debates and the Treaty of Tordesillas. As Spain and Portugal gained power and control in Mesoamerica and South America and the Caribbean, people back home in Spain and Portugal began to become concerned that what their men over there on the other side of the world were doing was not Christian, not human. And this kind of led to some moral problems over the conquest, and these were debated by the church. In many ways, the church kept the situation from becoming as bad as it could have. In other situations, the church was willing to help out because they saw profits in their own power. But the Valladolid debate was kind of this fascinating moment in world history where Bartolomeo de las Casas and Tomás de Sepúlveda had this big debate in the city of Valladolid in Spain about some of the things like whether or not Native Americans were human and what kind of rights Native Americans should have and whether Native Americans could and should become Christianized. And De las Casas, who represented the Native American point of view, and the Native Americans kind of won the debates in convincing Spanish culture and Spanish society as well as the church that these people were in fact human. It sounds silly to say that, but yes, they are in fact human. Yes, they can become Christian. Yes, they can go to heaven. De las Casas won that debate, and the church kind of moved in that direction. Another source of kind of conflict during this time period was the division of the area itself. What area should be Brazil's, what area should be Spain's, and this led to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was a treaty between Spain and Portugal negotiated by the Pope. And basically the Pope said, okay, here's this line, and anything west of the line, that's Spain's territory. Anything east of the line, that's Portugal's territory. And this is why Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking nation now, and connected to Portugal, whereas pretty much everywhere else in Central America and most of South America is all Spanish, speak Spanish, connected to Spain. It's kind of a funny thing though for the Pope to sit there and decide. I mean, no one asked the Indians what they thought. And some people point to the fact that this really wasn't a treaty over who gets the land, but it was a treaty to not fight. Okay, I won't fight you for land over here. I won't fight you for land over here. And that's really what the Treaty of Tordesillas was. All right, so let's turn our attention to labor systems in Spanish Latin America. Slavery was important, in Brazil and in the Caribbean, and it certainly happened in Spanish Latin America, but not as much. And this is part of why we don't have as big of African American populations in the Spanish-speaking parts of Latin America. Spain came into areas where there were much larger Native American populations. The die-off of Native Americans because of disease and warfare wasn't as high, and it was still disgustingly high, but not as high. And so Spain set up a system that they called the encomienda. And basically, a Spanish conquistador was given an area of land to be in charge of, and he was also in charge of all the Native Americans who lived on that land. So it's kind of like serfdom. And this is kind of like the serfdom system from Europe from the medieval period, is that you don't own people, you own land, and people are stuck on that land and kind of can't go anywhere, so you can kind of control those people. It's kind of a lighter form of slavery. Spain was also able to take advantage of existing tribute systems. Remember that the Aztecs were a tribute empire. They would go conquer people and then basically tell them, look, if you don't want us to beat you up again, you better give us gold and food and things like that every year. So Spain was able to step into that system and keep it going, and this made Spain wealthy. And so this is part of why central Mexico, where the city of Mexico is now, Mexico City is, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire, that's part of why that's a wealthier, more well-connected part of Mexico than, say, northern Mexico or Central America, is because of Spain's involvement in those existing labor systems. Spain was also able to take advantage of the Mita system in the Inca lands, right? The Inca emperors made it so that people had to go work for the government for a certain period of time every year. Spain just kept that system going because it was basically free labor for them. But the big story of Latin American economics and resources is sugar and silver, right? I mean, Europe just goes mad for sugar, and I don't know about you, but I like sweet things. Before this time period, European food was very bland. I mean, honey was about the only thing people had to sweeten their food with, and it was expensive and hard to get. All of a sudden, here's this cheap source of sweetness. Costs a lot of blood and lives, but money-wise, it's very cheap. And so, this is a booming, booming industry in Europe at the time. Also, the role of silver at this time period, right? China, typical China, does not want to trade with the Europeans for much of anything, but what China really does want is silver. And so this Chinese demand for silver and the discovery of silver in the New World, particularly in west central Mexico and the Bolivian highlands of South America, all of a sudden there's this huge boom in the silver trade. And, it's an east-west trade. I mean, the silver trade is perhaps the world's first major world trade pattern, because you've got silver going west towards Spain and Europe, and you also have silver going east towards the Philippines and then on into China. And this is part of why the Philippines was such an important area for Spain to control, because that's where the silver ships would go, and the silver would be there, and then it would get traded up into China from there. As I've mentioned before in a previous lesson, I mean, this is such a great period of piracy and privateers, which are, just a different kind of pirate, and that's because, there's all these boats full of silver and gold going across the ocean. I mean, what better way to make money than to knock off a few of those? I mean, you'd be rich for the rest of your life. But all this wealth didn't necessarily help Spain. They really mismanaged their silver wealth. Basically, they became addicted to luxury goods from China, and they kind of let their own manufacturing and production slide. I mean, this is similar to what Rome went through during the height of their empire. It was so easy to get cheap things and fancy things from China and the New World that Spain kind of let their economy go, and this would lead to some long-term problems in the Spanish government. The Spanish government was also spending money like it was unlimited, and then when the money ran out, the Spanish government ran out. Also, as I talked about with North America in an earlier lesson, the wealthy landowners out in the colonies are starting to kind of say to, the king back home, you can't control us out here. We're too far away. What are you going to do about it? Controlling an empire that big is very difficult, especially with the Atlantic Ocean in the middle. And so, kind of the money and the wealth and power that came out of, the silver trade and the farming in this area, for things like sugar, caused a lot of havoc in Europe as well. And so, like I said, I mean, governing colonies so far away was very difficult, right? How do you control a man who's halfway around the world from you? And so one thing that Spain set up was the viceroyalties system. A viceroyal is, vice is assistant, right, like vice president, royal, king. So, Spain set up a system of viceroyalties where, you kind of had the northern viceroyalty of New Spain, which is modern-day Mexico and Guatemala and El Salvador. And then you had the viceroyalty of Lima, which is in modern-day Peru in, South America. And so, again, this kind of made Latin American politics look a lot like Spanish politics, which is to say very much focused on kings and royalty and kind of a feudalistic system as well. Brazil was kind of a different thing, right? And so we can do a lot of compare and contrast between Brazil and Spanish Latin America, because of course this was Portuguese territory. And there really was no large, complex civilization when the Portuguese showed up. I mean, there was civilization, but it was much smaller tribes of Native Americans spread throughout the region. So the Portuguese really stepped in as the first complex civilization in that area, and they were in it for sugar, right? So sugar and slavery, so important. Later on, the colonies would shift to gold when gold was discovered, further in away from the coast, and lands were discovered which would make for good farming. And it was kind of a different thing here too, because Portugal was much more dependent on Brazil, and so there was a much more equal relationship, not a totally equal relationship, but between Portugal and Brazil, a much more equal relationship that, when Brazil gained its freedom and started to break away from Europe, was smoother and less violent than, for example, the revolutions led by Simón Bolívar and the revolutions in Mexico. And we got to remember that Brazil is kind of separate from the rest of Spanish Latin America, because of the river systems and the jungles and things like that. And so there's kind of a different mix of politics and blood in this area. As I mentioned in the Africa lesson, the Portuguese were much more willing to intermarry with Africans and Native Americans, and this is part of why we see in modern-day Brazil that the people are much more racially mixed than other parts of Latin America. And so this kind of leads to really the birth of a new race and a new culture, right? And when we talk about Hispanics or Latinos, we're talking about a mixed race people. And is this even a race? Is this a race by itself? Is a Hispanic or a Latino, is that a different race? Or is that the mix of Native Americans and Spaniards, right? When we look at Hispanic and Latino people, sometimes they're very, very light-skinned. Sometimes they're very, very dark-skinned and they look like Indians. Often that has to do with kind of the racial mixing in that individual's history. And so, we talk about mulattoes, which are, mixes of African and Native American and Spanish blood, or we talk about mestizos, which is, mixes of, Spanish and Native American blood. Fascinating as you look at people throughout Latin America and kind of talk to people about their ancestry. It's just really interesting. And so it's just, when we look at Latin America, we're really looking at a lot of mixing. Mixing of DNA, mixing of language, mixing of religion, mixing of culture. It could be that is the lesson that Latin American history can teach us, is, the process of becoming a new mixed culture. Because as our world shrinks and people mix, it's not always easy to do that. And certainly Latin America is an example of that kind of mixing. And so over time, Latin America becomes much more settled and stable and identifiable, and it becomes its own civilization, so that now we can talk about Latin American civilization as a place with its own spice profile and really a unique place that's different from Europe, different from North America, different from Africa, right? It's really its own unique civilization. And going back to our idea of the world system, right? I mean, Latin America is an example of the early periphery, perhaps, the earliest example of the periphery, although some theorists point to Eastern Europe as being the first periphery. But if we accept Latin America as the first periphery, right, because it's shipping out gold and silver and hides of animals and tobacco and cotton and sugar, it's sending all those things out to Europe, and Europe is taking it and working it into finished goods like furniture or clothing or processed sugar or things like that. Oftentimes they sold those things back to Latin America at a higher price, and so this kind of, again, makes Europe much richer, keeps Latin America in kind of a secondary or second place position, and so we can see in Latin American history the rise of the world system. And this system is still alive and well. I mean, we think about the relationship between a place like Ecuador and the United States. You know, Ecuador sends the bananas, the United States sends the computers. You know, it's still that kind of system. And over time, there are reforms in, you know, Latin American history, right? After the Bourbon family, a very powerful royal family of France, takes over the Spanish throne, they removed the viceroyalty systems and put in new systems of law and taxation with better control. You know, better transportation and military technology allowed the Bourbons to have, you know, greater power in the New World. And they tried to put more power back into the king's hands, and to defend those regions against the French and English, who were becoming much more powerful in that area. And those reforms would be successful for a while, until the revolution of Mexico and you know, the revolutions of South America. And we kind of see the same thing in Brazil, right? That the Marquis of Pombal tried to make the Brazilian economy and government much more organized and profitable for Portugal. Right? So he tried to get rid of the elimination of smuggling, try to improve taxation systems, change in slavery and plantation laws, and to introduce new crops. So, you know, at the end of this period, we're seeing a Latin America that's kind of once again becoming very stable and organized, and even starting to break away from Europe. And that's what we're going to see in our next project, right? Because as power shifts in Europe, as Spain becomes weaker and Portugal becomes weaker, and the Netherlands, you know, the Dutch, and the English and French become more powerful, you know, we're going to see that in the American colonies. The North American colonies are going to become richer and more powerful than the Latin American colonies. And, you know, the North American colonies also kind of had the advantages of the Enlightenment. You know, democracy and science and Protestantism, you know, allowed for greater technology and greater advancement in Northern Europe, and so that also gets transmitted across the ocean to the North American colonies. You know, and this kind of contributes to the prosperity that we see. North America was much freer, and so people had much more freedom to become prosperous, and those are kind of some of the roots of the inequalities between North America and you know, Latin America. So like I said, you know, in Project 5, we'll look at the Latin American revolutions and revolts led by people like Tupac Amaru in Peru, and Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, right? The first African American you know, revolution and the first freeing of the slaves, Simón Bolívar in Colombia, and the Mexican War of Independence. So that's the next step, is to see how Latin America completely breaks away from Europe. And so that's it. Consider how Latin America is a uniquely created hybrid of colonizing and indigenous cultures on a scale that had never happened before, and probably never will happen again. This sense of, you know, open land and massive mixing and massive immigration. I don't know if we'll ever see this again in world history. So, you know, Latin America is really a unique place. And I think I've shown you now some of the reasons why Latin America is so different from the United States and Canada, and why it was much closer economically to Europe than the American colonies were. And so all of this will help you in your understanding of the Mountain of Silver and Mountain of Skulls DBQ. That's a part of this project. Thanks.